Hello everyone, I'm MVL, and in this video we're going to be checking out the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster collection on the Switch. We're going to be opening up and we're going to be checking out gameplay footage for many other versions of these games. So, without further ado, let's take a look. So first we're going to open up the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster collection on the Switch. Then we're going to take a look at the features, and then we are going to compare the Switch versions to the many different versions of these games. This is the Play Asia release of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster collection. It was also available on the Square Online store in very limited quantities for the PlayStation 4 and the Switch. The Play Asia version was only available on the Switch. There is a very small difference in the packaging, but otherwise it is pretty much exactly the same with all 6 games on the cartridge. The games have been updated with new graphics. As you can see, one of the games, Final Fantasy VI, has a HD 2D scene, and that is very much in the style of Octopath Traveler, a game Square also released for the Switch. As you can see in the inlay here, the pixel art characters are displayed, which is the main difference between the Square version and the Play Asia version, the interior there being different, but otherwise pretty much exactly the same. Now with that said, let's take a look at some of the features of the Pixel Remaster collection. This collection includes Final Fantasy 1 to 6, with new presentation and features. I'm going to compare these new versions to many other versions preceding them. Which versions will you prefer? As with personal preference, there's no right or wrong answer. Whilst these new versions may have new features, in some cases they're actually lacking things from other releases. But before we compare the games, let's examine what's new for the Pixel Remasters. Firstly, the games appear in widescreen and with updated graphics. Some of these assets, which you may recognize, are from other versions of the games and are enhanced here, and they look great. My only complaint about the overall look is that whenever you stop moving, a prompt for options appears in the lower right of the screen. I wish you could remove that, but it's not too distracting. What is nice to see added to the screen, however, are mini-maps. They are an excellent inclusion and help you get around interiors, towns and overworlds much easier. In regards to some other features outside of the menu options, the in-game battles can be fast-forwarded now, which was an option added to previous Final Fantasy remasters released on Switch, like Final Fantasy VIII. I personally prefer to let the battles play out at their intended speed, as that's a representation of the original games. But that's my own personal preference, and I know a lot of people like having the option to speed through countless battles. This is another item that appears on the screen, in this instance on the top left of battles, and can't be removed. Another option which appears outside the main options is quick saves, which I'm actually really glad happens without player input, because it's really handy. If you forget to save in the overworld or save points and are defeated in battle, you can pick things back up from right where you left off, before the game over screen. Honestly, I think this is such a helpful feature, and you don't have to use it if you don't want to. You can easily just go back to the main menu and reload a save instead. But I think this is probably one of my favourite inclusions in these versions. Now in regard to inside the menu options, I'll cover the most notable options shared between the games. The most anticipated and requested feature since the original digital release of this collection was the ability to change the font. The new modernized font for this release is enabled for all games by default over the blocky classic text from the original release, which some may find a little harder to read. The new text style is easier to decipher, but to me it looks a little out of place with the rest of the presentation. Regardless, since it is the default option, you'll mostly see the modern text in the Switch gameplay here, though I would have liked to see an option for the text styles from the original games instead, rather than these two stylized text. There's also an option for a CRT TV style filter added to the gameplay. I've always thought options like these look gimmicky, since I've never actually noticed the scan lines when actually playing on an old tube television. Regardless, if you like this sort of thing, it is included. You also have the option to switch between the new arranged music for the games or the original music. though you can't switch between new and old graphics, which is a feature some remakes have now, like Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. I know that'd be a lot to wish for, but that would have been really cool. Additionally, each game includes a bestiary which is updated as you play, and a music player so you can enjoy your favourite awesome game tunes outside of playing. And there's also an extensive art gallery included as well. Now we're going to look at the games in comparison with previous versions, starting with the first game in the series, Final Fantasy. This is the original game captured from the Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Mini. It has fantastic 8-bit visuals from interiors, towns, overworlds and battles, and has wonderful music to go along with it. The only slight blemish to the presentation is a slight flicker at the bottom of the screen when moving in some areas, which was due to the limitations of the hardware. The game is really remarkable for a game of its time, and it sets a solid foundation for the other games to build on. The next version of Final Fantasy we are going to look at is on the PlayStation. But before we move on, I want to mention that many of the updated versions of these games drew from assets from the WonderSwan versions. But since the WonderSwan was only released in Japan, I can't include it. I will however show other Japanese-only releases in this video that I can capture, where they can be modified to play in English. Anyway, Final Fantasy was updated on the PlayStation as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection, which includes Final Fantasy 1 and 2. And because it's on the PlayStation, it naturally opens with a cool cinematic sequence. The presentation has been updated as you are led into the story and the game proper, where the graphical bump is really phenomenal. The music has also been updated, but unfortunately you can't revert to the original music. They have also added an easy difficulty mode for this release. I will also note that this is the European version of this release as well. A lot of the Western releases were slightly censored, like sprites being altered or a location like a church being changed to a clinic and things like that. And in some of the other versions like the PlayStation, some changes are reverted. But really, all these alterations are so minor, it won't make a difference whilst playing. Something that is different is the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy, which came as part of Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls, which included new versions of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. This game also looks great, though you will notice right away that it is considerably brighter than the PlayStation version. This is because it was designed with the original Game Boy Advance screen in mind, which wasn't backlit. Also, with the smaller screen size of the handheld, things have been moved around on screen and some areas look quite zoomed in or have some of the image a little cut off compared to other versions. The presentation is otherwise comparable to the PlayStation version, but without the opening cinematic sequence. On to the PSP version of Final Fantasy, and the opening cinematic sequence returns for this version. The game is now in widescreen, and there are also newly redrawn graphics based off the previous visuals. Overall, the appearance is more detailed, less pixelated and softer, but it's still easily recognizable from the source material. The perspective in the overworld also appears more 3D. It's going to be subjective to preference as always, but I really like the look of this version. I think it modernizes the visuals really well in keeping with the spirit of the original game. And I actually find it quite surprising that the Switch versions weren't based off the PSP style. Speaking of, let's move on to the Switch version of Final Fantasy. We've already covered some of the new features of the Switch versions, and for the most part, I'm going to have to skip over a lot of options for different versions, most of which will be similar for the consoles they're on. Obviously, the Switch version intentionally went for a pixelated look, and it still looks great, appearing closer to the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance versions visually, but without the PlayStation's cinematic sequences and adding widescreen. The Switch versions, I think, are intended to be more retro-inspired and provoke an experience similar to the original games, but with updated visuals. Looking at all the different versions of Final Fantasy side by side, there's a lot of differences between these different versions of the same game. Which looks best is in the eye of the beholder. On to Final Fantasy II, and we will start with the original Famicom version. Since this was only released in Japan, I'm capturing it from my RetroFreak with an English translation patch applied. This is another 8-bit game that looks and sounds simply fantastic. There are some gameplay elements added to this follow-up, and the flickering on the bottom of the screen present when moving from the previous game seems to be resolved. Overall, this is another classic and timeless RPG. Final Fantasy II made its way to the PlayStation overseas as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection. And because it's the PlayStation, you guessed it, it begins with a cool cinematic sequence. In fact, it's so nice, they play it twice. Once when you launch the game, and again when you start a new game. So cool. Anyway, the game has a new opening and great looking new graphics. This is a wonderful version. The Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy II included in Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls also looks really good, albeit a lot brighter than the PlayStation version to look good on the original GBA screen. There's no cinematic sequence in this version, and the opening sequence has been changed to lead into the story, but it does add some character avatars that appear during dialogue. Overall, like the other Game Boy Advance conversions, despite some compromises, this game is awesome. The PSP version of Final Fantasy II reintroduces the cool cinematic opening sequence, but you only get to watch it once this time. So cool. The opening is now more in line with the Game Boy Advance version, and some chat avatars are included in this version as well. Other than that, the graphics are enhanced, and the entire presentation is really beautiful. It is personal preference of course, but I really like how this game looks. All these games look great to me, but the PSP definitely offers an instantly recognizable graphical improvement. The Switch version of Final Fantasy II is incredibly striking with its stylized pixelated look. There's no cinematic sequence, but the introduction plays out like the GBA version with the same consistently good visuals and presentation of the other Switch versions. Looking at them all together, once again, there's a lot of differences through them all. Whichever you prefer, I think they all certainly have their own charm. Moving on to Final Fantasy III with the original version on the Famicom. Once again, this was only released in Japan, so this is captured on my Retro Freak with a translation patch applied. This is another 8-bit classic, and this game throws you right into a dungeon from the get-go to learn the basics. And then the game eventually opens up to a sprawling overworld with towns to explore and monsters to battle. Now we're going to check out Final Fantasy III on the DS. The original game didn't get a WonderSwan remake, so it didn't already have those assets that many of the other games built upon. Because of this, Final Fantasy III has fewer versions than some other of these games, so the first new version since the original was a complete 3D remake on the DS. There's a cool cinematic opening sequence, so cool. Then you're thrown into a dungeon to begin, but in this version your main character begins the game solo. The graphics are obviously completely different, and the music is reworked as well. The dual screens of the DS don't come into play all the time, and sometimes the top screen is blank, but the second screen does come into play during cinematic sequences, menus, and for the map. Ultimately, this version is very different from the original, and the display is another aspect that may come down to personal preference, but I still think it looks very nice. The PSP release for Final Fantasy III only came out in Japan, but fortunately, like some of the other Japanese PSP Final Fantasy releases, this game can be played in English. In fact, my copy of Final Fantasy II on the PSP displayed earlier was also Japanese and played in English. This version of Final Fantasy III is very similar to the DS version. It has a cool cinematic opening sequence and features the same remade 3D graphics as the DS version. But new to the PSP version, sometimes you have to zoom in the screen to identify items like switches you can interact with. Given how good the other 2D PSP games looked in this series, and with this being essentially mostly an enhanced port of the DS version with widescreen support added, it does feel like a little bit of a letdown not to see a new version with new 2D visuals. You'd have to wait years for the Switch version to see a new 2D version of this game. Not that this version doesn't look good and play great, however. Speaking of the Switch version, we finally get a new 2D remake here, and the visuals are in keeping with the style of the other Switch Pixel Remaster releases. As always, it's all going to come down to personal preference as to what you think looks best and which version you'd prefer to play. Even though this game had less different versions than other Final Fantasy games in the Pixel Remaster collection, it's no less brilliant of a game. And whichever version you like the look of and decide to play, you will be playing a great game. Final Fantasy IV wasn't originally released in Europe, but it did come out in America on the Super Nintendo under the name Final Fantasy II, since the real Final Fantasy II and III were only released in Japan on the Famicom. So we'll be looking at the American version of Final Fantasy IV, titled Final Fantasy II and captured on my Retro Freak. This 16-bit game really looks incredible, full of detail and colour from the game world, environments and battles. The music is also awesome, and the game even includes some Mode 7 graphics in some sections. You can really tell this game is a console generation ahead of what came before it, and since it's so prevalent, you can see why this game in particular received a lot more conversions to future hardware. Final Fantasy IV was ported to the PlayStation, released in America combined with Chrono Trigger as Final Fantasy Chronicles, and over here in Europe combined with Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy Anthology. And that's what you're seeing right now. And because this is the PlayStation version, you guessed it, it's got a cinematic opening sequence. Other than that, this version is very similar to the original version, and since the game looks so good to begin with, I don't think it needed any polishing at all to sell it to a new console generation, since the game still looks excellent. Final Fantasy IV Advance on the Game Boy Advance replaces the cinematic opening with a new opening sequence to get you into the story. The graphics have also been redrawn, and visual aspects have been altered to coincide with the GBA's capabilities and screen. As with other GBA Final Fantasy games, it is notably brighter, so it looks alright on the original, non-backlit GBA screen. I have to say, there is a lot I like about this version of the game. Final Fantasy IV was remade in 3D for the DS, and this release begins with a brand new cinematic opening sequence. So cool. And some of the dialogue sequences are now voice acted as well. But they still don't explain why your character sleeps in full armor. I guess he's just that hardcore. Anyway, the second screen is utilized a lot more in this release, displaying cinematics, maps, and battle screens. This game really looks cool, and it's nice to experience the story told differently from a different visual perspective. Now it's time to marvel at the PSP version of Final Fantasy IV, aptly titled Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection. Whereas many of the new versions of these classic games had new features such as new dungeons or other bonus content added, none had as much included as this release. Not only do you get a completely new version of Final Fantasy IV with included bonus in-game content, but you also get 2 other games. The first of which is Final Fantasy IV The After Years, which was formerly released episodically on mobile phones and is combined into one game for this release. The After Years is a new story set after the events of the main game. And that's not all, you also get Final Fantasy IV Interlude, a completely new scenario linking the other 2 games included together. And there's also a gallery mode, music selection, and bestiary included as well. The game opens with not 1 but 2 different opening cinematic sequences, one for Final Fantasy IV and one for the After Years. These are viewable if you hang on the menu screen or go to the gallery section, and they never won't be cool. Anyway, this game has stunning new 2D graphics that are simply jaw-dropping in widescreen, and the new music arrangements can also be switched to the original tunes if you prefer. With all these features, it really makes you wish that other entries into this game series had received the same treatment, but I'm for sure thankful that this wonderful game and complete package exists. Now as we look to the Switch version of Final Fantasy IV, I'm afraid in comparison with the PSP version, it appears lacking and almost seems like a bare-bones release in comparison. The thing to consider here is that the Switch versions I think are intended to replicate the experience of the original games but with newer graphics, which is why the Switch versions don't include things like opening cinematic sequences as they weren't in the original releases. But having said that, it does feel like a letdown not to have the bonus content of the PSP version, especially when you take into account the extra games, the After Years and Interlude not being on the Switch. Regardless, let's not sell the Switch version short. It is still really good and definitely succeeds at its intended mission. Final Fantasy V was originally released on the Super Famicom and only in Japan. I'm capturing it here on my RetroFreak using a translation patch. This 16-bit game once again uses just about everything the console is capable of at its best. It has vibrant and striking graphics, which includes some Mode 7 scenes. The game has, as expected, great music and atmosphere as well, and it all enhances an interesting story full of charismatic characters that develop their stories as you go. Even though it's a shame this original version of this game wasn't localized overseas, it would go on to receive releases overseas on different hardware. Speaking of, let's move on to the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy V. This version you're seeing is from the Final Fantasy Anthology Collection. Guess what? Can you believe it begins with a cinematic sequence, as was the style at the time? Other than some presentation changes, this version seems very faithful to the original game, which is a good thing because it's a great game that this wider release allowed more people to play. The only issue I can report about this version is an apparent save glitch present when using the game on a PlayStation 2, where the save screen will get corrupted, but will still work if you need to save. Also, apparently if you continuously enter and exit the save menu, it may clear away. Even though I actually used a PlayStation 2 to record this gameplay, I didn't encounter the glitch myself, so I guess I was lucky. Lucky for us, Final Fantasy V was brought to the Game Boy Advance as Final Fantasy V Advance. As with other Final Fantasy games on the GBA, the graphics have been altered, with the smaller screen size being taken into account and the brightness bumped up so the game looks bright on an original model Game Boy Advance non-backlit screen. Naturally, the opening cinematic from the PlayStation is gone, but chat avatars have been added during dialogue, which I always like to see to put a face to the characters conversing. The game overall looks very good despite some compromises being made for the hardware that it is running on. The Switch version looks incredible, with enhanced visuals bringing to life what you've already seen but in more detail than ever before. To me, what looks most altered in the Switch versions are the battles, which, as they appear in other Pixel remasters, have a more 3D perspective than originally, somewhat of the 2D HD style Square has used on Switch-released retro-inspired RPGs like Octopus Traveler, if you will. Every version of this game looks good to me. Which version do you like the look of most? We're going to move on to Final Fantasy VI, which wasn't originally released in Europe, but it was released in America as Final Fantasy III, since they previously released Final Fantasy IV as 2 in America and 5 was only out in Japan. I'm capturing this from my Super Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Mini. It's easy to understand why this game is regarded as one of the greatest RPGs of all time. This game looks amazing and it certainly uses the best of the SNES hardware. It has amazing sprite work and presentation, including epic sprite scaling and Mode 7 sequences. There were a couple of localization changes, such as some sprites being censored or some elements of translation changed, but it's nothing you really notice other than one of the introductory characters, Biggs, being renamed Vix instead. This game was an instant classic with beautiful graphics, music, and an engaging story that has only made it more engaging as time goes on, either as a fond revisitation for existing fans or a new must-play for fans of the genre. Final Fantasy VI was later ported to the PlayStation, and I'm recording the European release here. Because it's on the PlayStation, it begins with a so cool cinematic opening sequence. It'll always, forever, be cool. Anyway, the visuals and music are recognizable to the original. There has been some changes to the presentation, however, and if it did bother you, the sprites are uncensored in this version of the game, but I think that's an overblown issue. The real good news is that Vix has reverted to being properly named Biggs. Though still, many of these games have subtle translation differences regardless, it has to be said. I wish I could say this felt like the best version of this game. It is really excellent, but it is let down by speed, unfortunately. Not only are there long load times on this version, and this may just be because of European conversion, but the game also felt to me like it ran slower overall as well. Final Fantasy VI also found its way to the Game Boy Advance as Final Fantasy VI Advance. As you'd expect, there have been some notable adjustments for the hardware and the graphics. Some scenes are notably made to fit the smaller screen size of the GBA handheld, and also the brightness is dialed all the way up so the game displays well on a non-backlit screen. We also have to say goodbye to the PlayStation's opening cinematic. Goodbye, opening cinematic. You were always so cool. Anyway, we do however get chat avatars added in this release, which I really like, and this is a very impressive version of the game for the hardware that it's on. Finally, we have the Switch version of Final Fantasy VI, the last game in the collection, and I want to enforce that it really is quite good value to get all 6 games on one cartridge. I have to mention that I did notice some performance issues with this version of the game, with it slowing down at times. However, this was recorded prior to a new patch being released, so the minor issues I suffered whilst capturing may be fixed by now. This version features the same enhancements as the other Pixel Remaster games. There's quite a uniform look between all the Pixel Remasters, and they do look incredible. Sometimes there's a lot of effects added on top of the image, but ultimately I think they look great. Whichever game versions take your fancy, I hope this video informed you of the options available to you. And I do want to say I think the Switch versions are really great to jump into, especially if you are new to this series and you are looking for an entry point to start your Final Fantasy adventure. So there you have it. If you like the video, be sure to leave a like or a comment to let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. And if you'd like to, you can also support me through Patreon or YouTube channel membership. Thank you for watching. I've been MVL, and I will catch you next time.